Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Alden Kindreds of America's presentation of Who Wore What: Clothing, Textiles, and Dress Accessories in Plymouth Colony. My name is Desiree Mobed, and I'm the Executive Director. The Alden Kindred preserves and shares the legacy of Mayflower passengers John and Priscilla Alden at their homestead in Duxbury, Massachusetts, through guided tours, educational programs like this, exhibitions, publications, and genealogical research. I'd like to offer a special welcome today to our members who are joining us and whose support helps make programs like this possible. If you'd like to learn more about the Alden Kindred of America and Alden House Historic Site, please visit our website at alden.org. Today, we are honored to welcome independent researcher, reenactor, and historical tailor Axel Boy for a fascinating glimpse at the wardrobes of the Pilgrims, who might not recognize themselves as they've been portrayed through history with those ever so large buckles on tall hats and dressed in all black clothing. Axel will use written, pictorial, and archaeological evidence to offer a basic description of what the fashionably dressed and practically minded pilgrim really wore. Axel's been involved with reenacting both as a hobby and professionally for the past 25 years. During the last 10 years, he's focused on researching and reproducing clothing from the 17th century and 16th century, and is well known for the pieces he's tailored for the New Plymouth Guard, which is a reenactment group here in Plymouth. After his talk, we encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the question and answer function. If you have to leave early, we will be posting this on the Alden website. So I'd like to go ahead now and welcome Axel Boy. Thank you.
Hello, all. As Desiree said, my name is Axel Boy. I'll be running through pretty wide range of topics for you today, but basically what I do want to touch on are the basics of women's and men's clothing, the textiles that you would have seen and what they would have been used for, as well as how, as costumers and historians, we actually make those choices when we're recreating those garments. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to dive right into this. So,
why is this? Why did this small?
everyone see that screen?
Yes.
Yep,
Thank
that's
you.
good.
Let me get it into full page mode here and we'll get going.
We're not in.
Slowly. There we go. All right. So as I said, we're going to be covering men's and women's clothing, the textiles and what they were used for in early New England here, as well as how we make those decisions when we're actually researching and recreating them. So without further ado, let's get something cleaned up right off the bat. The Pilgrims look more like this than they did like that. This is a sort of a Victorian invention that has unfortunately stuck around, and we're all familiar with the big buckles on the hats, wearing nothing but black and brown clothing, and that simply was not the case. What I hope to go through as we're going through the presentation is to sort of dispel those myths and give you a better sense of what they would have been wearing. One thing that I do want to mention as I'm going through the talk is this is a very broad topic, and I'm going to be painting with pretty wide brush strokes. Mostly what I'm focusing on here is maybe the first 30 years of the Plymouth colony and the kind of clothing that people would have worn. By 1660, clothing is really starting to change pretty drastically, but we'll be focusing basically on the first period here. So get started, we're going to go into women's clothing, and shout out to my friend Galen, who was kind enough to let me use this image It's a wonderful reconstruction of a woman's outfit that she made. So, sort of the basics of women's clothing, starting from the skin out, is you would have a shift, or sometimes called a smock. That was your linen undergarments that you would have put everything else on top of. Petticoats, which were sort of the next layer, you would have skirts, overskirts, aprons. If you were wealthy enough, you might have a garment called a body or stays, which was a structured garment and the precursor to the corsets of later eras. Over the top of that, you might wear something like a waistcoat. And if you've ever been in New England in the wintertime, you're going to want something over the top of that too. So you might have had things like gowns, coats, things, outerwear garments that would stand up to the cold weather. I'm going to start out with smocks, shifts, and shirts. It's easier just to cover both of these for men's and women's clothing right off the bat, and we'll go from there. They're both essentially just a long, loose-fitting linen garment. It would have been worn right next to your skin. It actually helps to collect all of the grime, grit, and keep your other clothing clean. Linen shirts and smocks could be easily laundered in comparison to, say, something that is made out of wool, and this would have been really your first line of defense in keeping yourself clean.
Yeah.
Many people would have had multiple ones, so while one was being washed, the other one could be worn. They didn't last terribly long. For those of us who wear these on a routine basis, we are either constantly mending them or having to replace them. But that was the point. You didn't want to have to replace your outer garments or wash them constantly, so you wore these underneath. They could be very simple like this, or if you were a higher social standing, you might have had something fancier. These are both just shirts that I made for myself. So back to women's clothing. Again, thank you, Galen. So the petticoat is your second layer of clothing. It would generally consist of a fitted upper body garment, normally made of something like canvas or wool. It could have had a skirt either attached to it, or it would have been a separate skirt entirely. That is your base layer. That is the absolute minimum amount of clothing that you would be seen in public in, and even that would be pushing a little bit unless you were working, doing some sort of manual labor. As I mentioned, bodies and stays, these are actually a garment that start out in the upper sort of layers of the social status and are sort of drifting down into common people's clothing from circa 1600 onward. This one is actually, the image here was actually one that my partner Angelina spent most of the COVID lockdown hand stitching. They would have been generally made out of something a rigid material. You can use things like heavy linen canvas, and then they would have been further stiffened primarily with whale baleen. That's a byproduct of the whaling industry, and it actually acts as a rigid structure to the garment. You can see on this image, all of these individual channels would then have the baleen stuck between them. Don't worry, no whales were actually harmed in the creation of that. That has wooden reeds in it. Finding whale baleen is a little too difficult these days and illegal. So. The waistcoat. This is another very common garment. There would have been sort of a fitted upper body garment that would have been flared out at the waist. This is, sort of regular day wear. Most of them had these inserted gores, which allow for a sort of a fitting shape where the waist flares out. One thing I would like to point out, we commonly have, we like to seriously define garments. And back then they were a little less strict with their definitions. So when I say waistcoat, and if you're reading historical records, it might mean this, or it could mean a woolen undergarment that was used as a thermal layer. So just a warning there when you're actually doing the research, if you're out there by yourself doing it. So jump right into men's clothing here. This is really my specialty, so it's a little more fleshed out. But we already covered the shirts. You would have been having a doublet, which was sort of your upper body garment. You would have been wearing hose or breeches. Below those, you would have had stockings on. Women would have been wearing those too. And over the top of that, you might have worn a coat, mandilion, cape, or possibly a cassock. So, doublets. These are the mainstay of men's fashion. Beginning at really the end of the 14th century, they come into style. You're not wearing tunics anymore and stuff like that. You're actually getting a really proper fitted, tailored garment. They run all the way up to roughly the 1660s, which at that point you get the invention of the three-piece suit, so they sort of fade out. I've got three different examples here that I wanted to show you, and this is kind of highlighting, this is a very broad topic. You can see the changes in fashion between, circa 1610 up to about 1640. But general characteristics, they would have been made of multiple layers, and they would have actually had the same sort of tailoring that modern garments have in them, a bit with slightly different materials. They would have been closed with a lot of buttons. Some of the surviving ones in museums actually have up to 30-something buttons just on the center front. Hose or breeches, as they're later called. These are generic men's clothing, your leg wear. They came in a wide myriad of styles. Again, they change over time with the fashions. These are just a few examples. This one over here would be, any part of the first half of the 17th century. These wide leg pairs start to come in a little bit later. And you also have these very baggy ones right here, but you can actually see here, this was the new Plymouth Guard at the Aptuxet Trading Post, and you can see a number of different styles there. Dress accessories. I'm going to be covering a little bit of both men's and women's here, just because it's a little easier for organizational purposes. Obviously, everybody wore shoes. You would not last long in the New England winter without footwear. Most people at this time would have been wearing shoes and not boots. To some extent, men are wearing boots, but they would have generally been pretty short, like ankle length. These are all made out of leather. These are, they wear out very quickly, and they're one of those items that were in desperate supply all throughout the colonial period. Caps and hats, we've got a variety of styles here, including this hideous monstrosity called a thrum cap. Keeps you really warm, but it's definitely not much of a fashionable item, I can tell you that. They could have been either knitted in full, they could have been made from wool felt, or, if you were fashionable, beaver fur felt. But nobody would have been out in public without some sort of head covering. Women, as you saw in the pictures earlier, I'll jump back a bit there to Galen. Would have had some form of covering, be it a linen coif like this, or, a hat. Very similar to men's. There is actually one surviving hat that is associated with the first, I do not off the top of my head remember which one of the Mayflower families it is associated with, but if you ever get a chance to go to the Pilgrim Home Museum in Plymouth, there is actually a surviving hat from the 17th century on display there. Other things that you might have seen. And now we're into the, if you're going to survive in the New England winter, you're going to want extra outerwear clothing. And instead, my PowerPoint decides to jump when I don't want it to. There we go. So outerwear garments. Some of these would have been unisex and worn by both men and women. Some of them were more specifically a male garment. Sadly, I could not find any good pictures of women's long gowns. But starting over here, we have what's referred to as a cassock. That is a very loose-fitting garment that was primarily worn by men. Women did wear them, but they were generally a little bit different, where they actually opened all the way down the front instead of just being a closure at the neckline like this example here that I made. They could be worn over the top of your doublet, or there is some evidence to indicate that they were worn in lieu of a doublet. They're actually very cool to wear in the summertime because being loose and baggy, they provide for a lot of airflow. And that's actually what I mostly wear in reenacting in the summertime because I don't want to get heat stroke. The mandilion was another, it's very similar to a coat. However, they tended to have these completely functionless yet fashionable sleeves that don't actually, you can't put your arms through them. Fashion is weird, was weird then, still weird now. So, capes would have been worn by both men and women. They're a pretty common thing that show up in probate inventories. They're a pretty universal garment. They're a great extra layer. You can always throw them on over the top of whatever else you're wearing. It's just that little bit of extra. So this last picture here is actually me wearing more of a mid-century outfit. And the coat there, I just want to point out, is based on one of the few surviving examples that of regular people's clothing. It was actually bricked up in a chimney in England and thankfully survived. So people like me actually have a better idea of what that garment might have looked like. Textiles. From here on out, we're going to be kind of looking more at how we draw from the historical record and how we make the sort of decisions that we do as costumers when we're recreating these garments. So textiles at this period in time, everybody who is going to be, all of the fabrics and actually most of the clothing that is going to be in the Plymouth colony, basically for the first 20 odd years, if not later, is all going to be imported. There is little to no domestic production of textiles realistically well into the 18th century, where it starts to finally pick up enough that we don't have to rely solely on importation. 17th century, almost all textiles are imported. The earliest example or documentation that I have heard of for weaving and the creation of textiles in Massachusetts is a 1638. And even then, it was essentially an act of desperation because they couldn't get enough fabric into the colony. So textiles themselves can sort of be lumped into two broad basic categories in the 17th century. You either had textiles that were produced from animals, so you either had wool from sheep, or you might have had things like silk, which are actually come from the silkworm, although that would not have been terribly common with most people in the Plymouth area at the time. They might have had a little bit of silk, small bits of it, you know, the lining of a collar, little tiny bit of trim, might have had silk on their buttons or their buttonholes. But in general, you know, that's really the domain of the upper classes back in Europe, and it's not going to be seen as much here. While not a textile, but I did want to mention it, and I know we did have a question about it. Leather and fur, and primarily leather, is actually a very important material used for making clothing, especially men's. There are so many references in the written sources that detail the use of leather for the creation of men's doublets, hose, and actually my introduction picture there is a picture of me wearing a suit of leather that I created, and it was inspired by a probate inventory that I'll get to in a minute. Other than animal products, you would have had fabrics that were produced from vegetable matter. So primarily in the time, they are going to be from linen, which is the flax plant, or from hemp. They're readily available. They came in a wide range of different qualities. And again, a lot has to do with your social standing as to what you had. So the types, this is where things start to get a little bit confusing. If you're lucky enough to have a fabric store near you that still carries wools and linens and silks, If you go into most of them today, you will be incredibly lucky if you can find even two different types of fabric of any of these. Whereas in the 17th century, there are all sorts of woven materials. Each one would have had a name, each one of them would have been more common in use for various garments. I'm going to start over here with the woolens. Frieze, which is a incredibly, oh, hello, Zoom, and get the tailor's apprentice in here. Frieze fabric was a very, very thick and coarse wool. It was normally either undyed, so it would have been the color of the sheep. It might have been white or a dark gray or even a black brown. It's primarily worn by the lower sorts. It is fantastic. I have several items of clothing that I have made from reproduction frieze, and I can stand out in 10-degree weather and it's fine. Baize is a lightweight, plain woven wool. A lot of times you see that in use in sort of like either undergarments or as a lining material. Broadcloth would have been the most expensive of the woolen textiles. If you're at all familiar, like modern coats, wool coats, or Melton fabric is what we commonly call it today. It would have been very well felted. It would have been relatively waterproof, would have been brushed, and it just would have been the nicest of the wools that you could have gotten. Stuff, that's sort of a catch-all term for worsted or lighter weight fabrics. uh, like a modern suiting wool is probably the closest analogy that we have. They're very breathable and they're actually very comfortably worn in the summertime. Kersey would have been sort of like the cheaper version of broadcloth. It was generally a twill or diagonally woven fabric, mostly in use by the middle and lower classes. It's a good stand-in. It's still pretty waterproof. And russet is an incredibly important fabric for basically anybody below the top of the social ladder. It was generally an undyed wool, so it would have been gray, natural, something like that. Behave. And it shows up all the time in the written records. Linens. If you had linens for the most part and it was an outerwear garment or anything other than a shirt, it would have been canvas. Canvas is very durable. Think of like an artist canvas today. It's a wonderfully abrasive, resistant material. It breathes well. Many outerwear garments and day-to-day usage would have been made out of canvas. Could have been made out of linen, or it could have been made out of hemp. The farther up, just like today, what can you afford? More money you have, the finer the fabric that you're going to be able to purchase. Cambric and Holland are both examples of fine weight, very nicely woven linen fabrics. Those would have been worn for things like the shirt collars, ruffs, or potentially even your shirt or smock, if you had the money for it. As I mentioned, silks don't show up a whole ton out here in the colonies, but they're worth noting that weaves like taffeta, grosgrain, which is ribbed silk, or even satins were available at the time. While we're on the subject of fabrics, I did want to bring this up just for a second. There's not a whole lot of surviving textiles really at all associated with the early years of the Plymouth colony and Massachusetts Bay. One of the few examples that we have that is traditionally associated, and it's actually quite interesting because it's Priscilla Alden, are these scraps of a damask wool fabric, which is actually, it's a reversible. So you can flip it either over and you'll just have a slightly different colored pattern. The scraps are held in various museum collections. they're woven from two different shades of blue. What they might have looked like back then, yeah, probably was a little bit different. Those dyes tend to fade a little bit. But it's pretty neat that we have anything that, might have actually been associated with the people that were there at the time. The fabric itself may have been from a garment, but it also might have been from something like a bed hanging, which is essentially just a piece of fabric used to keep your bed warm at night. Let's see what I'm doing for time here.
Hey, Thomas Rook.
This is just kind of a fun one, and this is actually one of my ancestors, so I thought I'd throw it in here. He actually, Thomas Ruck,
Yes.
immigrated to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1638, and basically the shipping captain lost his stuff, and so he was suing him for the value of his goods. But it's a fun thing because it actually highlights how they had to bring in all of their own materials. Highlighted right here, stuffs, fustians, canvas, bed ticks, and linsey woolsey. So those are all types of materials. He was actually, I believe, a draper back in England. So, or I think he calls him a planter when he got to the New World, but I believe he was still a draper back in England. Fustian, I didn't mention earlier, but that was actually a mixed fabric. It could either be made from linen and wool or actually linen and cotton, because the cotton is beginning to be used by, Western Europeans more and more throughout the 17th century. Bed ticks refers to a very heavy weight, either linen or hemp canvas. Primarily, that was used for making mattresses. And linsey woolsey is kind of what it sounds like, a mix of linen and wool.
Well, ticking.
I don't know if he ever got the value of his money back, but it's pretty interesting regardless. Colors. Despite what many of us grew up thinking, they actually had quite a lot of colors, and there's quite a few of them that show up in the written record. So all of the threads and the fabrics that you can see in these slides these are all ones that either I dyed or a friend of mine has dyed using the materials that were available to people in the 17th century. All of these dyes are derived from plants, insects, or are using mineral dyes. So you can actually use things like iron, which will produce the black right down here. So as a professional plant nerd, this is one of my main areas of interest. So, and there's actually suggestions written to people who are coming to the New World that you might want to bring the seeds with you just to plant dye stuffs. Whether or not people did, I don't know, but it's pretty interesting to think that they were thinking that far ahead, that they would want to actually be planting the stuff to dye their own clothing. Just to give you a brief, the purples and the whites there, those are actually done with a species of plant called logwood. All of the blues up here were done with either woad, which was the most common blue dye, or with indigo, which wasn't as commonly used in Europe, but it's beginning to be seen more and more. The ones next, nope, those are also woad. The reds down on the bottom are dyed with either madder root, which was actually one of the cheapest dyes available. You don't really want to plant it because it has a tendency to take over. It's rather invasive today, but it produces wonderful reds. Actually, the brighter of the two there was dyed with Brazil wood, which was being imported into England at the time. The fun thing about doing natural dyes is actually it's just like mixing paint. If you want to get green, what you generally do is you dye it yellow first, and then you dye it blue. It's exactly the same as mixing paint. So anyway, moving on. All right, so how do we know what these things look like? Well, contemporary art is probably the easiest and most accessible way of getting an idea of what people might have worn at the time. these are all English wood blocks that come from various broadside pamphlets, which were the newspapers and kind of more like tabloids of the day. They're not super detailed, but they're useful for costume historians because they kind of give an idea or at least the basic profile. Sadly, if you're really interested in English clothing, they don't have a, in the early parts of the 17th century, you don't have the sort of tradition that you did in the, like, say, the Dutch, where they had genre paintings of people across the social spectrum. Most English art from the period is solely of the upper classes. It's still very useful because anyone who was further down the social ladder might have been dressed similarly. It's just not going to be with the finest fabrics, or it might not have all of these little details here, which, looking at this painting, I'm not sure if that was woven or if it was actually cut into the fabric. That's a tailoring technique or a dress technique known as pinking and slashing, where you're actually making cuts into the surface of the fabric at the time. But these are still very useful because they give us that we can see the profile, we can get an idea of what they might have worn. It might not have been from high class fabrics, or, you can see the damask or, maybe velvet down here on his hose, but it still gives us a very good idea of what they might have looked like. These are just some more. This one is dated about 1620. The young woman here is, again, I think this one was dated from 1630. And then you have this rather more dour gentleman over here that actually dates from the English Civil War period in the 1640s. So, but there again, they're very useful. We can see, the way the clothes are constructed, the way that they're going to look. But this is the most useful part to me. Since the original Mayflower passengers, many of them were part of the Leiden congregation, and they had spent considerable time in the Low Countries, I can actually rely, and many costume historians can rely on Dutch artwork. And the Dutch were really, really good at depicting common people. You have wonderful paintings like these that show people throughout the social, status. And these are just they're a gold mine. You can pick out all the little details, everything you need to know. These folks are a little bit higher up the social ladder. This is actually a great fun painting too, because the guys on the boat are actually jousting on boat. I don't know why, but it's fascinating regardless. But again, we get this nice overview of various members of the social status. You can see the difference in the clothing between the boatmen from these sort of gentry or upper class folks who are observing the thing. These are really where I draw a lot of inspiration from and use a lot of in my creation of costumes. Written records. We are very lucky to have pretty extensive written records from the Plymouth colony. I've picked out a few examples here, which I think highlight sort of the diversity in clothing, as the colors as well as what they were. Got this first one here that's dated from a Will Wright, dated from 1633, that has one red bay waistcoat, one white cotton waistcoat, and one old black stuff doublet. So that's fantastic. We know what kind of material it was made of. We know what color they were made of. And, that's a great basis for those of us who want to recreate this stuff. The one below it is actually one of my absolute favorites, which was William Kemp, who lived in Duxbury, died in 1640, and the probate account is from 1641. He was probably a tailor and is one of the earlier people to actually be practicing his craft. That's 20 odd years after the Mayflower, though. But his probate inventory, he had tons and tons and tons of fabric. He had threads. He had all sorts of, items that a tailor would have needed. But my personal favorite, one leather doublet with silver buttons valued at £1. That was an expensive piece of clothing right there. And it's also fascinating, we get this idea of them all being very dour and everything else, but silver buttons that's pretty flash. So, you just got a couple other different ones, black suit and girdle being a belt, one black cloak, three horsemen's coats. That's another one that's worth mentioning. In Mort's relation, one of the gifts that was originally given to Chief Massasoit by the Mayflower passengers was a horseman's coat made out of red cotton. Horseman's coats were sort of a loose-fitting outer garment, basically like a one of the later, like a cowboy duster. They were worn basically to protect your clothing when you're out riding in the fields. So this is another one, Mary Ring. She had a lot of really nice stuff. Really, really nice stuff. But I picked this particular little section from her probate inventory just because it has things like violet-colored petticoat, violet-colored waistcoat mingled colors, which would have been something that was woven from two different colors of yarn. So you get this really pretty sort of mottled effect on the cloth itself. Yeah, black, you've got violet, you've got, let's see, red. So it gives you a nice picture of how many different colors that they would have been wearing at the time. It wasn't all, it might have predominantly been black or brown or undyed fabric, but doesn't mean they were all wearing it. Lastly, I would like to touch on the archaeological evidence, which not so much with the clothing itself, as really doesn't tend to survive in the ground. Those are generally only found on things like shipwrecks or waterlogged ground in an anaerobic environment. But metal survives, textile working tools survive. These are all actually pieces that have been associated with the original Alden house and the digs that were done there. And one of my favorites is, of course, the scissors there that, I can just picture one of the Aldens there mending their clothing or doing whatever they needed doing, snipping away there. These are the kind of items that are actually very useful, though, because they help flesh out the details of clothing. Like this right here. This is a hook. We still use these today. Hooks and eyes. They were used for closing clothing, or they were actually used to join your doublet and your hose. They didn't rely on belts or suspenders. Those don't come in until much later on. But this is one of my reconstructed ones on a pair of leather breeches next to one of the original ones. The archaeological record is vitally important when we're doing this because it really does help you get all the details right, all the fastenings, all the buttons, everything like that. So that's pretty much the extent of my talk. I would like to open up the floor. I know we had a bunch of questions that were submitted ahead of time, and I would be delighted to see if I can answer any of them. So
Thank you so much, Axel. That was absolutely wonderful. And in addition to the questions that people had shared ahead, we have a number more that have been added. I also want to welcome again everyone who's joining us. We have participants coming from the West Coast and all the way to Scrooby, England. So
nice.
it's wonderful to have them. You also have, of course, I was shout out to the New Plymouth Guard, a number of whose members are joining us today, which
Hi, everybody.
part of. Yes. So, and you also have some reenactors in obviously, because they're asking some very specific and detailed
questions.
questions. So I think without further ado, we should go ahead and get started. And I think one of the ones that just came in was from Deborah. And on the inventory, you mentioned all those fabulous colors, and you can just imagine all the beautiful violet that she was wearing, which I think it's that same person. But what is a Dutch? Is it a yaki or a yoke?
Yes, actually, and that I forgot to mention it, but that was one of the reasons I picked that section. It was actually a head covering. Essentially, it's a linen head covering. It's similar to like a coif. It's within the same sort of family. I wish I'd pulled up an image of it. I did throw my email in here, and if you shoot me an email, I can actually send you images of what they look like, and I would be delighted to provide that to you. But it was basically just it's just a linen head covering, and there was something that got picked up by the Leiden congregation while living there, and they do show up, and they were obviously wearing them. They're practical garments, help keep your head warm. So,
And from one of our members, Terry. So, is there a term for the shoulder caps over those sleeves on the cassocks or coats?
um, you kind of there's no real hard and fast. I generally call them wings myself. You don't really tend to see them written in or a whole lot in written documentation, but they're kind of a mainstay in most 17th century clothing. Generally, you'll sometimes see them called epaulettes by costumers or wings, sometimes shoulder tabs, but they vary in style quite a bit. Again, if you're interested, please shoot me an email.
It's a very distinctive styling feature,
And
and it's
actually, this
both men and women, I see.
you can see this one here. This is actually Angelina, my better half, who is sometimes the drummer for the New Plymouth Guard. This is a male doublet here, and I wish I could zoom in. The style that's seen there starts to come in post 1600, where they're actually made of individual sections. They normally have a little bar in thread stitched between them. I wonder if I can shoot back here. Oh, there he is. You can see it real distinctly right there where he's actually got the silk trim in between each one of the little tabs. So yeah, it's a very distinctive style. It kind of disappears by say 1650. You stop, I don't know if you well, unfortunately this gentleman is wearing a cape, but so you can't really see his shoulders, but by 1640 they're starting to disappear.
Another thing that is a question and really strikes you when you look at all these beautiful clothes is really the amazing amount of buttons, both from, I'm thinking of poor Priscilla and the 10 children and constantly having to resew them. No wonder why the sewing scissors is broken.
Yeah.
Archaeological piece. Um, any comments on that? I mean, obviously, it's a fashion, but
It's because fashion was ridiculous. I mean, the higher up the social ladder you got, the more buttons you had. There are a number of extant ones, and I really recommend you check out the Victoria and Albert Museum's website because they have wonderfully detailed clothing of high class garments that have survived from this time. But I mean, the spacing in between the buttons is about a half an inch. I'm fast sewing buttonholes, but that would still be hours and hours of my life to stitch 30 something buttonholes into the front of a garment. Buttons could have been done either, they were often made of glass, they were made of pewter, they could have been made of brass or copper alloys. One of the most common styles was actually done with a wooden bead that you then stitch thread over, and you can do it in all sorts of different patterns. They were sometimes done with gold or silver wrapped thread if you had the money for it. If really, really interestingly, they actually found one at Jamestown Colony where everything had rotted away except for the wooden core and the gold that had been wrapped around the thread. If you check out Historic Jamestown's website, you can see it right there.
So a question came in just about knitting
Mhm.
and, obviously stockings, but anything else?
Hats would have been very, very common to be knitted. Let me jump. jump back here, find my hat slide. Yeah, stockings would have been basically stockings would have either been done in two ways. They would have been a knitted garment, or they would have actually been made from fabric and then sewn. And I'm frozen. Did everyone lose me there for a minute?
Nope, you're good. You're
Okay.
back. Yep.
Mine froze up there. So doo-doo-doo. So both this hat and this hat are actually both knitted. Uh, it's exactly the same as we knit today, except it would have all been done on 4 needles. Knitting was a massive part of the British economy. You have entire towns that were basically devoted to knitting hats. Once they'd been knitted, they would have then been fulled, or what we call felted today, which is rather therapeutic, I will say, because I basically take a hammer handle and a lot of hot and cold water and beat it until it turns into a hat. It's a lot of fun, actually. Yeah, both
So,
of this tall hat and the thrum cap there, they're knitted garments. They were very common. There may have been knitted gloves as well, but I think those are better documented to the later half of the 17th century and not the earlier period.
so another question came in about patterns, if one is to try to recreate some of these clothes today. And
Yep.
I think you all have some suggestions on the new Plymouth Guard website, but any other
Um,
recommendations?
so there are actually, and I wish I'd made a slide of it, I could have listed all of the books that I recommend. There are some commercially available patterns. I wonder if I can actually, yeah, I probably can't type fast enough to do it. Some books that are really worth checking out that have wonderful patterns in them. One is a series called, or by The Modern Maker. He is a gentleman who uses 16th and 17th century Spanish tailoring pattern books and manuals that do survive and interprets them so you can make your own patterns of these clothing. In fact, that's actually a lot of what I use, although I make them English. There's also a book series that is really, really worth investing in is 17th century men's and women's clothing, which is put out by the Victoria and Albert Museum. Those are about the most in-depth books, and they will, I mean, if you need patterns, pull them right out of there. If you just need to buy patterns, though, there are a number of companies that do sell ready-made patterns. But if you're really interested in this, I would recommend you go down the route to study those books and draft your own patterns because the difference will be astonishing from a commercially available one. About the only like paper patterns that I would really recommend, and they do need some tweaking because they're actually earlier, are the Tudor Tailor. They make wonderful patterns. They're also wonderful people. So, but they're normally earlier than the 17th century.
So some practical questions. One from Lisa,
Mhm.
and certainly one we always get at the museum is the washing schedule. And, what would have been washed, what you couldn't, they just didn't bother. And
So
a little more
actually,
about
I
that.
I'm stuck on the right slide here actually for that question. Basically, if you're washing your garments, I assume that's what the question was pertaining to. Um, it would have been your linen under things, and you would have also it would have been we're all familiar with the collars, and actually there's a picture of one right here of the falling bands. Those would have been washed all the time. And my computer has decided to give me warnings about its battery life, unfortunately. But you would have washed those because that would have picked up all the grime. You basically would have been washing your shirts on a weekly basis if you could. Your shirts, your smocks, your falling bands, any of your linen items, your wool or your outerwear garments, you probably would have just brushed them down rather than actually washing them. So.
And another one of those practical questions. So, really considering the large size families, and even if, you're looking at maybe one or two outfits per person, that is a lot of sewing. So
Yes.
any comments on that? Although we know that, certainly that would have been done a lot more than we would think of today. And so we may have lost Axel. I know he mentioned that he was running low on battery power. So I think we're going to go ahead and close our session now. And Axel provided his email, so we'll follow up. Please feel free to follow up with him on email. And we will be posting a recording of this talk on the Eldon website within a few days. I want to thank everyone. Okay, I do see him coming back on. I want to thank everyone, though, for joining. I'll try wait one more minute to see if he's able to reconnect and answer any of these last questions. And if not, I want to thank you all for, oh, you made it. All right.
I'm sorry, my
That's okay.
yeah,
We're
sorry
going to
about
blame it
that.
on your cat, Zoom.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go ahead and just try a couple more. We were going to talk about the amount of clothes, just the daunting amount of clothes, even if that the wardrobes are very limited, and just understanding the role of all of this sewing and how much time it would have taken.
Yeah. Because all of the clothing is actually going to be imported and people aren't sewing their own clothing, a lot of the stuff that's being brought in is probably used. It's, it's a full-blown industry back in England and in Europe where you've got, tailors, their apprentices, this is a major, major endeavor. Most people are not making their own clothes. And certainly not out here, and they might be mending them, and you would have spent probably most evenings you would have been mending something. But yeah, I mean, most people owned at least, two outfits from the skin out. Many people own more. And, that's a major investment. And clothing was very expensive and it was worn until there was nothing left.
So, didn't you mention something about that when we were, just chatting beforehand? And I guess it was the children's clothes, right, that were found
Yes.
in the wall. Do you want to just highlight that? That was such an interesting, intriguing, fascinating point.
It is, there's not a whole lot of surviving sort of everyday garments. Most of the stuff that survives in museums were the top of the social ladder, so to speak. But there was like a folk magic practice of concealing garments within a house for, good luck, protection, whatever. And there are two surviving doublets that belong to, children or, young men that have been found in England. One was made out of a linen or hemp canvas, and the other one was made out of a wool, blue wool. It was probably dyed with woad. But it's fascinating because, they've got repairs on them. But when they finally aged out of them, they ended up, hiding them away in the walls of the house just to help. If you're interested in that, I recommend look if you Google Concealed Garment Project. It was a project run by I don't remember which university it was in England, but they have a fantastic website all about various garments that have been found. And really, they're the only way we know what regular people's clothing, the only ones that still survive.
And any comments on the shoes? And you mentioned boots. Of course, we're very interested in this at the Eldon House because Priscilla's father,
Hmm.
had been a shoe merchant.
Oh
And he
yeah.
brought shoes and boots, quite a number of pairs with him. So really a little bit more about them. You mentioned there are not that many boots, but and how people can find proper period shoes today for reenactments.
So probably the easiest way that you can track them down, there's a couple vendors here in the US who make reasonable, relatively historically accurate and affordable products. But if you were to do a Google search for a latchet shoe, that would be, and yes, and I see that in the comment, that is the concealed garment project. Um, Latchet shoes are probably the easiest Google search to find ones if you're interested in doing reenacting. There's a couple different vendors like Viking Leathercraft who have some reasonable footwear that are well priced. Otherwise, you're going to have to go overseas for the most part. There's a lot of amazingly amazing cobblers over in and shoemakers over in England. Shoes were always in short supply. If you've ever worn pure leather, there's no modern soles on them, they wear out in a hurry. The stitching fails. And there are accounts in Plymouth and in all of the colonial areas of people just being desperate for shoes. I actually my family comes from a shoemaking town in England originally, at least my mother's side. It has been a shoemaking town since the Middle Ages, but I mean, these are things that they're always, and there are suggested packing lists for people, for colonists coming to the New World. And basically all of those packing lists recommend you bring at least 4 pairs of shoes with you. You might only bring 3 shirts, but you're going to want at least 4 pairs of shoes.
So those several hundred pairs that William Mullins had probably went pretty quickly.
Yeah. I mean, those would have been gold to the Alden family. They were always in need.
So I did copy, we'll send you a copy of any of the questions. And again, I think I want to be respectful of everyone's time, that we should probably close this out. And again, thank you for joining today. Please look for the recording of this on the Alden website and future programs as well. Axel, thank you again for this wonderful
My pleasure.
presentation. I just, knowing what people wore, really, when you wear those clothes, really helps put you and just gives you such a better understanding of those times. And so thank you again, you all, and we will look forward to seeing you at our next program. All right.
Please,
Thanks, Axel.
my email is right there. Please feel free to send me any of your other questions. I am always happy to talk 17th century clothing with anybody. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Axel. All
Bye.
right. Bye, everybody.